I'm standing here today on the front porch of the Charles Hackley House, one of the finest Queen Anne houses to be found anywhere in North America, and an integral part of our local history. Over the next 3 episodes, we hope to show you how the County Museum is undertaking the restoration step by step of this magnificent home. It's the goal of the County Museum to bring it back to its splendor as it appeared in 1890 when Charles Hackley and his wife Julia were residents here. One of the most unique factors in working on this restoration project is not only do we have such a fine example of Victorian architecture in the Hackley house, but it's actually part of a compound. Charles Hackley built the house in conjunction with his best friend and business partner, Thomas Hume. And the house next door was that of Thomas Hume's. Together, directly behind both houses, is the barn that served for both households, where the horses were kept and feed was kept and their carriages and so on. We're in the process of restoring all 3 buildings to revive this unique Victorian compound. Over the next 3 episodes, we're going to take a look at how the museum has gathered the information to do the capital restoration, the history of the houses themselves, and then we're going to take a look at the exterior restoration and the interior restoration. So come along and join us as we take a look at our old house, the restoration of the Charles Hackley house. In the first episode of our old house, we're going to be taking a look at the history of the Charles Hackley house and its importance to our community and to the region. We're also going to take a look at the historical background that the County Museum is researching to aid us in the restoration. Now, the first point I'd like to make is that the title of this series, Our Old House, was very carefully chosen. The restoration of the buildings at the Hackley and Hume site is very much a community project. These homes are important to us because of the influence that Charles Hackley and Thomas Hume had on the development of this community for the 19th and the 20th century, and the support that has been received that has allowed us to do the restoration has very much been community-wide, county-wide, and I feel that this project is very much ours, all of ours, as citizens in this region. Charles Hackley came to Muskegon just before the Civil War. At that time, it was a sleepy little town of less than 10,000 people. Over the next 25 years, the city and the county would literally explode in economic size, population, and importance to Western Michigan. This was because of lumbering. By 1880, Charles Hackley had amassed a fortune of over $12 million. And from 1890 until the time of his death in 1905, he would return over half of that fortune, $6 million, back to the citizens of Muskegon through a series of philanthropic projects which have increased the quality of life up to the present day. Now, how and why did lumber barons like Charles Hackley begin to amass such great fortunes throughout the Muskegon region? Well, the answer very simply is white pine. Throughout the 19th century, Michigan, which had been largely unexplored and bypassed in the western migration of the United States, contained thousands of acres of white pine. Down here in Muskegon, right in the heart of that white pine territory, we had a natural waterway system with the Muskegon River that provided transportation to move this product to market. Throughout this area, lumber camps would be set up, the trees cut, and moved down to Muskegon where the sawmills would chop it up into lumber. And as a result, this became a focal point for the economic development of this side of the state. In the summer and fall of the year, lumber barons like Charles Hackley would go out and purchase prime pieces of land that contained the white pine. Working all winter long, the lumberjacks would cut the mighty white pine, and aided by the frozen ground and the snow-covered roads would skid the sleds of trees and logs down to the riverbank. The winter's worth of cut logs would be stacked at a rollaway, a high bank overlooking the Muskegon River. In the spring, when the river's engorged with the runoff from the winter's snow, a log would be driven out, the logs would all tumble into the river, and the driving, pushing the logs down the river towards Muskegon would begin. River rats would guide the logs down the river. This was an especially dangerous job. Trying to move the logs, keep them on their way down to the mill, avoid log jams, and keep your footing was an extremely hazardous occupation. The logs themselves were each individually marked on the end with log marks. This would allow them to be sorted out in the next phase of the operation. In this manner, millions of board feet of lumber were brought down to Muskegon Lake. Even today, we find logs popping up from the bottom of our rivers and our lakes throughout West Michigan. Once the logs arrived at the mouth of the Muskegon River, emptying into Muskegon Lake, the logs were sorted out by their log marks and set into pens for each individual company. This work was done at the booming pens, a vast complex where hundreds of workers were involved. From the booming pens, an individual company's logs would be tied together and hauled to an individual sawmill across the lake. There, the logs would be lifted up to the second floor of the mill and sawn into the rough-cut lumber. This lumber would be stacked on a dock and shipped to Chicago by means of a sailing ship. Now, throughout this whole process, throughout all of this activity, the value of the lumber kept rising. And as a result, millions of dollars were made here in the mills of Muskegon in the latter half of the 19th century. There were numerous lumber barons who amassed large fortunes, but of all of them, Charles Hackley and Thomas Hume were the most successful. By 1887, Charles Hackley, having amassed a huge fortune and being the most influential lumber baron in the region, made the decision to build the home of his dreams for both he and his wife Julia. In 1887, he purchased the last vacant lot of land on Webster Avenue. The next year, they began construction on his home as well as the house next door belonging to his business partner and friend Thomas Hume. Behind the two houses, they began construction of the city barn. We believe this photograph is the earliest known of the area. We can see men on the front porch of the Hackley house that we believe are painters putting the finishing touches on the Hackley house. In 1889, Mr. Hackley's home was complete, and he and his wife Julia moved in. The house design was a strong Queen Anne style with a heavy influence of an exotic design called Moorish Revival. Charles and Julia Hackley would live in the house until their deaths in 1905. They both died a short period apart, and at that point, the house was then passed into the hands of their adopted daughter, Erie Hackley. Erie lived in the house off and on up through sometime in 1921. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, after Erie had moved west, the Hackley house was rented out to a series of families. Those families, in turn, sometimes rented out individual rooms in the house. There are residents still living here in Muskegon County who remember renting rooms and living in the Hackley house during this period. In 1943, with World War II raging throughout the world, Erie Hackley made the decision to donate the Hackley house to the American Red Cross. Here in Muskegon, the Red Cross took the building over, made some minor modifications to it, and made it into the region's first blood drive center. They operated in the house through the 1970s when they acquired new offices on Webster Avenue. By 1971, the three buildings of the historic site were falling into disrepair. A group of community citizens got together and made the decision that they were important and deserved to be saved and restored. Gathering community support from the Muskegon Chronicle, the Quadrangle Club, the Greater Muskegon Women Club, and the Questers, the Hackley Heritage Association was born. For the next 20 years, the Hackley Heritage Association would work to stabilize the 3 properties at the site and to begin initial attempts at restoration. In particular, one man, Mr. Herb Strom, led the way. His love of the houses led to the beginnings of their restoration process and set a standard for excellence, which we're still working to achieve. In 1986, the voters of Muskegon County approved a countywide millage to provide the economic support to aid in the restoration of the houses. At that time, the properties were transferred to the Muskegon County Museum. Since 1986, the museum has been working to do a museum quality restoration on the 3 buildings. Here in the recent past, we've been working on the Hackley House. The objective of the museum is to restore the Hackley House to its early 1890s appearance as it looked when Charles and Julia Hackley first moved in. In addition to the work being done on the Hackley House restoration, returning it to its 1890s appearance when Charles and Julia first moved in, long-range plans have also been made to guide the work for the Hume House and the barn. The 3 buildings of the site were designed by architect David Hopkins. A native of Argyle, New York, Hopkins came to Michigan in 1864. Working from his office in Grand Rapids, he designed all 3 buildings. He was also well known for his mail-order catalogs of house and barn plans. The design chosen by David Hopkins was, as has been described, Queen Anne. Now, this style is unique for its time because of all the varied detail that the Queen Anne style incorporates. What is unique about the Hackley House, however, is that it has this varied texture and detail, but unlike most Queen Anne houses, every one of these details was individually made specifically for the Hackley House. This image of one of the stained glass windows, which are another unique item of the Hackley House, show how Hopkins mixed styles. Here in a Queen Anne pattern, we have the addition of mirabe, which is a horseshoe shape. Mirabe is usually found in Moorish designs and specifically on Islamic prayer rugs. This is an example of the kind of exotic design style that was very popular throughout the 1880s and 90s. Another example of the Moorish revival design throughout the house is the onion or Turkish dome on the barn. Another important architectural feature of a Queen Anne home is variations in sidewall surfaces. By this I mean a difference in texture, pattern, and color. As in other cases, however, we find on the Hackley House, this variation goes to extremes that would not normally be found in a Queen Anne house. A Queen Anne house usually has a large one-story porch that may, as in the case of the Hackley House, wrap around to the side. What's unique about these porches is their decorative trim, usually called gingerbread. Once again, however, in examining the Hackley House, we find that this is far from standard gingerbread. This is all uniquely designed and custom crafted for this particular house. Another architectural element often found on a Queen Anne style house is a tower on one corner of the front facade. As we see moving around the Hackley House, it's made up of literally hundreds of architectural elements. And in order to preserve the splendor of this magnificent house, each one of these architectural elements is going to have to be addressed in the restoration phase. Having identified the architectural significance of the house, we're now ready to begin the restoration process. But long before we can hire carpenters, we can begin to work on the individual elements of architectural significance, there's a lot of research that has to be done to ensure the accuracy of the finished project. Now, how does the Muskegon County Museum go about this research? Well, we have three sources of information. Number one is documentary. Taking a look at those papers, receipts, photographs, bills, and so on that have survived. Secondly, we take a look at the physical evidence. A house is just like an archaeological site. Over time, as people have modified it, have repainted it, or made changes to it, there are traces of information that can be examined by digging through the layers. And finally, we can go and take a look at other restoration projects and other research that's been done on similar types of houses to see how they have addressed problems and to take a look at what conclusions they have come up with. Another example of documentary evidence that we have for our research is the large number of photographs that still exist of the Hackley house. Fortunately, because of his prominence in the community and his wealth, the exterior of his home was photographed a number of times throughout the years. Likewise, the interior of the house was photographed shortly after they moved in. These images are important documents to aid us in the restoration work. Fortunately for the Hackley House project, many of the business papers of the Hackley and Hume Company still exist at the archives located at Michigan State University. These papers were saved by Mrs. Jean Hume Browning, a descendant of Thomas Hume. While not complete, they do provide hundreds of pieces of information on the lives of the families involved in these houses and on the construction of the houses themselves. A graduate student at the university has been hired by the museum to search through these boxes of documents page by page and to duplicate anything that has to do with the houses themselves. This information is forwarded to the museum and will then be incorporated in reports. An example of the type of document that's being retrieved from the Hackley and Hume business papers is this check made out to the Kelly Brothers Manufacturing Company. All of these little bits and pieces of historical information about the house are brought together and examined by the museum staff. The museum director is personally responsible for the actual restoration of the house. The site administrator at the Hackley and Hume Historic Site is responsible for taking this historical information and formulating it into a series of planning documents, such as historic furnishing plans, historic structure reports, and so on. These documents are what aid and guide the restoration process. Here in episode 1, we've been taking a look at the architectural and historical significance of the Hackley house. One of the things we found is that in its Queen Anne design, it is a rich and varied mixture of textures, designs, and styles. One of the key elements of a Queen Anne house is that you should be able to look at it a second time and never see the same thing twice. We find this throughout the architectural elements as well as in the interior decorative treatments. Now, the first part of this episode was filmed over at the Muskegon County Museum, where we have produced an exhibit that explores the topics that we've discussed in the first half of the show. We've now moved across the park and are standing in the Muskegon Museum of Art, where the second half of the exhibit is on display. This part of the exhibit takes those individual architectural elements out of the context of the house and explores them for the rich and varied splendor on their own right. An example is the side door. When viewing the house, the detail of this door sometimes gets lost. We can see the horseshoe mirab design that we've been talking about. We can see the wood carving that has been described. But just looking at this door, it becomes an art object itself. And this, I think, points out the importance of all of the variety of details that we find in the Hackley house. One element of the job of historian that I enjoy most is the fact that we're quite often involved in detective-like work. In doing research, we uncovered these photographs of the interior of the house. This particular one is of the first parlor. And in going through and listing the objects and the different decorative items, we see centrally located this portrait of Julia Hackley. We're extremely fortunate that that portrait in this 100-year-old photograph is still in existence. And as we complete the interior restoration of this room, this portrait will be returned to its original location and placed in the display. It's important in our restoration efforts that we not only understand exactly how the building looked and how it worked, but also to understand why. In taking a look at the decorative elements both inside and out, we look for the influences that affected not only the architect, but the Hackley family and their own individual tastes. An example is this building, the East Indian Building, in 1893. Located at the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, it shows the influence of the Moorish Revival style as it affected design and taste throughout the United States. We know that the Hackley family was well-read and well-traveled, and that they were heavily influenced by the newest and latest in designs and fashion statements of the period. Recently donated to the museum, we know that this piece of furniture had a prominent place in the Hackley's interior decorative scheme. It's actually a small curio cabinet, but once again, it's a prime example of the varied texture and design that would have been found in every single item in and around the house. In the collaboration to research and produce this exhibit at the Museum of Art, we've worked closely with the staff to take a look at the decorative elements and the artistic styles found in the Hackley House. Standing here with me is Henry Matthews, who is the curator and currently interim director of the Museum of Art. And I've asked Henry to join us to get some of his insights into the design elements and styles that we find in the Hackley House. Welcome, Henry.
Hello, thank you. Welcome to the museum.
In taking a look at the objects that we've taken out of context and brought here into the galleries, what has been your reaction and the public's reaction in taking a look at these objects and the designs behind them?
Well, I think the first thing that hits you is how rich and intricate they are, which is something that sort of gets lost when they're in context. Mm-hmm. You know, the rooms are so richly decorated, there isn't a relief space anywhere, and that's what makes it wonderful. And it was completely in keeping with the tradition and the times and the modes of the times of the late 19th century to have a house that was just filled with a great variety of styles and materials and lavishness. And so there's nothing wrong with that. The nice thing is by pulling these things out, these objects out, and having a chance to look at them in an almost I don't want to say sterile, but isolated manner, you can suddenly recognize and appreciate the incredible detail and the skill involved in producing just these items on a single basis. When you look at these chairs, they become sort of a tour de force of not only of carving, but also of design, because we're dealing with so many different mixtures. We're talking about the basic shape of the chair is that of a great medieval chair that would have been used at the head of a table or possibly even as a throne. But and the material is there as well. But then the detailed carving, the twisted columns, a reference to Solomonic columns. You can see that at the Cathedra Petri in Rome, the great Bernini columns, and a reference to originally the temple of Jerusalem. And then the rich carvings here, these acanthus leaves, which are a reference again to the classical world, the Roman world, and will be picked up again in the Baroque period and now mixed together with this basic medieval style. I mean, they don't really make sense when you start taking them apart, but that's the fun of it for us, because we're looking at them with hindsight and seeing where they borrowed from all these different times. Now, you know, the lines are great fun. They're almost cartoon-like, and I don't know that they were intended to be funny, but they certainly strike us that way today. I think
here in this day and age, yes.
Today, right. 80 years later, or 90 years after they were made.
Well, Henry, throughout episode 1, in taking a look at the artistic styles, we've been emphasizing the point that what makes the Hackley House so unique is that not only do you have a typical conglomeration of patterns and designs that you would find in decorative elements of this period, but that in the Hackley House, they were of the highest quality. They were all specially made for the house. And did you find that when you began to examine the furniture and the windows that we have here in this gallery?
Absolutely. These are premier objects of the very finest quality. These are as good as anything you'll find if you go to Europe and visit the great castles or the private homes, which when we do, we always feel the need to take a picture. Well, a friend of mine says, when he looks at something like this, he says, you know, if we were in Europe, we'd take a picture of it. Well, I think we can do it even now when we're not.
Right here in Muskegon.
Right here in Muskegon, because they are of that quality. And they really do speak to us about the taste of the time. You know, when we think about what we accept today in our homes, a rather sterile surrounding, we prefer white walls or very clean lines, and that's really important to us overall. I mean, certainly there are the exceptions to the collectors, but the ultimate house of the highest design of the turn of the century was a very sophisticated mixture of everything the world has to offer. So we're seeing Orientalism, we're seeing all the past historic styles mixed together beautifully, and it's really very sophisticated and as you said, of the very highest quality.
Well, Henry, when you take a look at these objects, and when you look at the historic photographs that we've uncovered of the interior of the house, it appears at first glance that it is just a mixture. It's a jumble of things. But through your eyes as an art historian, is this just a mishmash, or is this a carefully designed and constructed environment that was built for the Hackleys?
Oh, I think it's absolutely a carefully designed environment. I think somebody really thought about what was going in here. The use of materials, the different woods, the carvings, the color scheme, which we're just beginning to put back together again through all kinds of clues, and you're working with restorers to find those. This is not a happy accident. This is a very carefully planned environment, and is an environment that was meant to be read by the visitor as and very specific messages were being sent. It says, you know, I'm an important social person, I have the best taste, I have lots of money, this is where it's happening, this is sort of the apex of society. And I think that's exactly what was intended to be conveyed, and I think that message is loud and clear.
And those kinds of visual statements that we're reading from the photographs and that are coming out through the restoration process, those were the types of statements that a well-to-do person would make and communicate in a home of the period.
Absolutely, because that strata of society, really, when we start to think about it, these are all self-made men and women, but they're imitating something else. They're imitating the European aristocracy, which has been in these kind of homes for centuries. And in Europe, they would have lived. A house like this might be 1,000 years old or 500 years old, and they might actually have a medieval chair and a Roman example and all. But in the 19th century, the style was to mix and match and put it all together and borrow from everyone. But of course, in this country, we're so young and so new, we didn't have all these styles to borrow from, and we don't have the old things, so we're making up our own versions of them. And that's exactly, I think, what happened here.
Throughout this program, we've been taking a look at the history and significance of the Hackley house. I think we've also been taking a look at Charles Hackley the man. We've been taking a look at how he amassed a fortune, the house that he built for his wife, and how he himself lived. I think that one of the regrets that I might have as a historian is that I've completed so much research and investigated this man's life so much that I feel that I know him, and yet we'll never have the opportunity to meet him and to shake his hand. We are in the process of restoring his home to its appearance as it was when he first moved in. In the next two shows, we're going to be taking a look at the actual restoration techniques used for both the exterior and interior work. We hope that you'll be able to join us for episodes 2 and 3, and we certainly appreciate the fact that you've joined us today for this episode of Our Old House.